I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And how old were you when you started reading Joan Didion? Well, I was an adolescent, straight up. But Eve Babitz came later for me, and luckily we have Lili Anolik and her new book, Didion and Babitz. And Lily's also the author of sort of a biography that's of Eve, but also of the city of Los Angeles in the 60s and 70s, which is pretty great. It was a Discover Great New Writers pick for us back in the day. And Lily's here to talk about the two women that are pretty firmly identified with Los Angeles now, even though it took a little bit of a renaissance, which Lily kicked off actually in the pages of Vanity Fair in 2014. So, hi, how are you? I'm so glad you're here.
Delighted and thrilled to be here.
So, 2014, though, I came to you when the book, somebody sent me a galley from Scribner, and I was like, who is this? What is going on? Sometimes you come to people late. But you had discovered Eve, what, 2013, 2012? The piece comes out in 2014. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, well, so I started reading her in 2010, and it's a weird thing because in my memory, I found her through Joe Alcohol's, the guy who wrote the great trash plays Basic Instinct and Showgirls, and he had a memoir. And in my memory, he quoted this writer named Eve Babitz in Hollywood Animal, but I can't find it. But at any rate, I came across a quote of Eve's on Sex in Los Angeles,
Uh-huh.
and I thought it was great, and I Googled her, and there was very little on her, but I got a secondhand copy of Slow Days Fast Company, and I just booked for it. And she had no presence. She was gone. The only thing I knew about her, I knew she'd had some sort of wild life in the 60s and 70s, and that there had been an awful fire in the late 90s, and that she didn't see people anymore. So she had no internet presence, but she was in the phone book, and my brother was at USC for business school at that time, and I was visiting him, so I just walked near her house, and I just started stalking her eventually, and it went on. I couldn't get anywhere with her for years, and I got close with her sister, her cousin's ex-boyfriend's ex-girlfriend, that kind of thing. And then finally, she got curious and called one of the ex-boyfriends that I could take her to lunch. I'm like, for Los Angeles the next day.
So we got this Vanity Fair piece in 2014.
Yeah.
When did Eve's papers go to the Huntington Library in Pasadena? Was that before you started working on the new book or while you were working on the first book? Or
No, the first book was completely done, so that came out in 2019. Yeah, and I'd moved on. I was doing other things. I was under contract. I had done a long podcast off of an Esquire piece on the writers of been in college class in the six. But I was supposed to be doing the book on this, and then Evie dies. And I knew her sister, so Evie went into an assisted living place in the last year of her life. And she lived in a hellhole of an apartment in West Hollywood. Like, the folk was unbelievable, right? Like, it was the chaos and self of that place was beyond imagining. So I assumed that there were no papers. You would never think anything could serve that apartment. But her sister was cleaning out the apartment to sell it, and she found at the back of a closet this stack of boxes that their mother had packed decades before, right? They were pristine, right? Like, the duct tape hadn't been, they were still sealed, right? Otherwise, he could have destroyed it for sure. That was just her way. She couldn't help herself. It was manuscripts, it was artwork, it was journal, but mostly it was letters. And it was letters she'd actually never sent. It was saved, but never sent to people to form a kind of diary. And so I didn't get into it until right after she died. The papers had sold to the Huntington, and Randy wanted me to take a look. I was out there for memorial. I took a look. The first thing I pulled out was a letter that Eve had written Joan Didion in 1972. And I knew I was back. I knew forget Bennington for a while,
okay, so 1974 though, and that puts us sort of firmly in 1972. So it puts us firmly though in the Franklin Avenue house that Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn sort of legendarily threw all of these parties at. And if you've read Griffin Dunn's memoir, The Saturday Afternoon Club, there's quite a lot of Franklin Avenue in there. And if you know Franklin Avenue now, I'm pretty sure the house is still standing. It's just probably been propped up, or has it been taken down?
It's still there. It's like some religious cult.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It seems proper to me. It seems totally.
That's hysterical. But it turns out you find this letter, and of course, LA was not the biggest literary community at the time. Like, it's reasonable to presume that their paths would have crossed, right? Joan Didion and Eve Babitz. Wait, is this the one that mentions A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf? Is this the one where they're like kind of frenemy fighting over Virginia Woolf?
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one, and actually, you know what? That's actually 1972, Joan has just moved out to Malibu, out to train.
Okay.
So, the Franklin Avenue scene is really it's done, though it's got its best it's kind of a slightly bit of a movable piece, I guess, a little but at any rate, when Eve the literary scene in LA really was quite small, so they would each other, but Eve, when they met in 1967, was not a writer.
Yeah.
She was an album cover designer and groupie, self-described groupie, and had already taken that famous photo, with Marcel Duchamp and people. So Eve was not a writer when she and Joan first encountered one another, but by 7 she was. Joan had got her into, she'd shown a piece that she'd written about Hollywood High to Joan, and Joan had got her into Rolling Stone.
When did you start reading Didion?
There was a pretty popular girl in high school, kind of dangerous and cool, and I remember we were in a car, and we both read a lot, and I was telling her I read a lot of Pauline Kael, and she told me she read a lot of Joan Didion, and we swapped. Gave her I Lost It at the movies, and she gave me the White Album. So I was 15, 16.
Yeah, that seems kind of the perfect. I mean,
Right.
unscientific survey. I would say that's when a lot of us come to Didion. And the thing is that Didion was kind of a hot ticket right from Play It As It Lays. I mean,
Right.
Run River. Wait, did Run River really do anything though? That was technically her first novel, right?
Her first novel that sank without a trace that kinda came but Slouching Toward Bethlehem is just before Play It As It Lays,
Okay.
and that's like a cultural touchstone book. So that's
Right. Okay. So Slouching Towards Bethlehem changes the landscape for
right.
Joan and makes her really into sort of Joan Didion icon, like the photo of her with the Corvette and the cigarettes and all of that, and then Play It As It Lays, which is a novel I really love, which is why I always think of it as coming before Slouching, which is weird. It's probably just because I read Play It As It Lays before Slouching, but you couldn't really come up with 2 more divergent personalities in a way. I mean, we think of Joan Didion as this very cool, collected, withdrawn, sort of arch personality, and Eve is kind of well, not that.
Well, I mean, you look at their bodies, right? Like,
Yeah.
Eve is like, my wife has a double D, like, she's curvy, loved food, loved guys. Girls too. I mean, there was always the funniest thing, there's only one journal, 1969 to 1970, every entry, she's either on a diet or telling herself to go on a diet, like, she
Right.
let she just was like a sensualist, and Joan, was abstemious, was child-sized, it's not just that she's slender, she's tiny.
She always looked frail, even in photos. I mean, it just like bird-like, and that's sort of it was always kind of wild to me. I was like, "How?" And then if you look at photos of her next to her husband, like, he looks gigantic, and in fact, average-sized dude just looks gigantic in these photos. But they're both approaching Los Angeles as sort of with a raised eyebrow in a lot of ways. I mean, Joan's a transplant. Eve is not a transplant. She grew up there. Igor Stravinsky was her godfather. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
2 sides of one place, right?
and I would say Eve probably didn't I don't know if Eve approached LA with the raised eyebrow. I mean, how could she? Like, she was a native daughter,
Right.
and I think loved Los Angeles wholeheartedly and totally, and I think Joan was skeptical of it, and I had Eve resented her skepticism, I would say.
Totally fair. I mean, what surprised you the most when you were putting together this book? I mean, you spent a lot of time at the Huntington. You also chased down a lot of people that a couple of whom I didn't even realize were still alive. I mean, there's a
Right.
lot of legwork that went into this new book.
No, for sure, but I just was laughing, it's getting excerpted one of the chapters, the Noel Parmental chapter is getting excerpted in Vanity Fair, and they wanted to fact check the quotes, but everyone was dying, 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 like, oh, Noel died at the very end of August, and then Bobby yeah, well, anyway, everyone was dying off.
What surprised you? I mean, you spent a lot of time digging around in the papers at the Huntington. You spent a lot of time talking to people. You spent a lot of time chasing a story that I think a lot of us didn't really know existed.
I didn't know the story existed. I knew Eve so well. I mean, I
Mhm.
hundreds and hundreds of hours between 2012 and 2021 when she died. I talked to her all the time, and she always answered every question I asked. And she talked about Joan a lot. And she talked about Joan in a kind of circuitous way, which is very to her nature. She was a very direct person. She would say these very barbed things about Joan, and I also knew she loved Joan, but I had no idea how on top of one another, how involved with one another they were until these boxes. So that was shocking to me. The Noel Parmentel, I had no idea that there had been that Joan's key love affair was not with John Gregory Dunn.
All right, since Noel is being excerpted in Vanity Fair, originally I was gonna not quite jump into Noel because my eyes got really big when I was reading that part of the book. Yeah, I always thought Dunn was sort of the great center of Joan's life, and then you tell me that what, the first 3 books have characters based on Noel, and even Run River is dedicated to him?
Yeah, Noel Parmentel was this. Joan is a virgin, an actual virgin when she moved to, right? She had a serious boyfriend at Berkeley, but she's still, a very young woman. She comes to New York to work for Vogue, and she falls in with a guy named Noel Parmentel. And Noel is one of those guys who's sort of faded from history or from memory. He was a writer, a journalist, but really he was a man about town, kind of a mover and a shaker. Handsome, big, always wore a white suit, Southern, hard drinking, womanizing, and super charming. They fall into a love affair, and he's a big promoter of her work. He gets her into magazines. He gets her into the National Review, her first byline. And novel has been turned down all over town, and he hustles it to a guy named Ivan Oblinsky. He gets her published, right? He's also a main character. He's the kind of handsome cad uh, guy in Run River. It doesn't work out between them. He won't marry her. He does not want to get married again. And he tells her, she has a kind of nervous breakdown that she writes about, and goodbye to all that. To help her out, he says, it's time for you to get married, and he picks a husband for her. And it's a kind of like lackey of his, like a younger guy who's kind of a hangers-on and a worshiper of his, John Gregory Dunn. Then he says, marry him, and she says, okay, basically. And that's how that happens, And John Dunn is great for her career. I remember Noel, we were sitting on his porch. He lived country in Connecticut he was 97 when I met him. And he said that he would edit Joan. Noel would edit Joan, but he wouldn't edit every line. And he said John would edit every line. And that was huge for Joan, right? So John Dunn was also extremely a shrewd operator in terms of career. And I feel like she marries Joan as a way of marrying Noel and as a way of marrying her work, right? John is going to be great for her writing and great for her career. And that is how it happened. It worked out just that way.
It totally works out, but I mean, I was surprised. I was just kind of like, wait a minute, what did I just read? What is happening here?
How? It was shocking to me. It was shocking to me. That's such a famous literary marriage.
And Eve was single her entire life, right? I mean, lots of love affairs. Steve Martin, Harrison Ford, like names where I was like, oh, this is kind of fascinating before they were famous kind of thing.
Harrison Ford, Edwin Shea, Jim Morrison, all of the Eagles, Warren. Like, okay. Annie Leibovitz. It's like an unbelievable Joseph Heller. Her sex resume is unbeatable.
But she never settled down.
Yeah. No.
I mean, and I still kind of can't tell if she really ever wanted to. I don't think she did.
No. And when she did, I remember her sister made me laugh. Yes, sometimes she would want to get married to these guys, but that really just meant that what Miranda said to me is that meant the guy paid the bills.
Yeah.
Kept her. That's really what marriage was. That's what was her idea of marriage.
Watching these women sort of circle around each other on the pages of the book, obviously. Part of it is like watching Joan Crawford and Betty Davis a little bit. And I'm like, what is going on? Who are you? The 60s and the 70s were not necessarily hotbeds of community, right? I mean, they had some sort of shared experiences, but they also did kind of look at each other like, well, there can be only one. And I'm kind of laughing about this because they're both so ambitious and they're both talented. And I'm like, what is going on, women? What is going on with you? Like, why?
It's a complicated dynamic for sure. Because Eve had no better friend than Joan, who did love writers, but went out of her way, really out of her way to help Eve. She agrees to edit Eve's first book, and Eve fires her from the job. And if anyone behaved badly, it was Eve. It was a complicated thing. I mean, there was rivalrous feelings, but there was a kind of perilous intimacy between them, and they were opposites, but they were doubles. I mean, it was complicated between them.
Did you end up writing this in a linear fashion, or was it kind of I found the things, wrote the things, and then figured out how to organize? I mean, it reads like you just basically sat down and wrote the whole thing and it all came together at once. But I just listening to you talk and the stuff that you're uncovering as you're kind of doing it and where you had to go and what you had to find, it doesn't seem like this is the kind of book where you can be like, and then in 1968.
Wasn't linear. No, you're absolutely it was no way linear. I mean, in some ways, I wrote this book against my will, right? Like, I
Okay.
have to do another book. I felt that I'd given Eve 9 years. I did my best by her. I really tried very hard with, Hollywood's Eve, and I wanted to move on, and I read that letter, and I knew I had to go back, and I meant to just revise the Eve book.
Yeah.
And but the like, it's a whole my understanding of her is so profoundly changed by the contents of Office, and then I realized I'm writing a shadow book on Joan Didion as well, and I get to know I mean, you know what I mean? It wasn't a straightforward thing. It wasn't like I wrote a pitch and then wrote the book.
Right.
I was sneakily doing this, like, I was pissing off my editor at Scribner because I was doing another book. Do you know? I
Yeah.
was lying to myself. I was telling myself I was just gonna spend 3 months revising the Eve book and I'd be done, but the books take over, they hijack you.
It is 2 different books. I mean, I've read both, obviously, and they are 2 different books because, I mean, LA is such a character of its own in Eve's Hollywood. Like, you can't like, that book, I can't imagine how much time you spent chasing down archival anything from the '60s and '70s, and especially Eve's work on album covers and all that kind of stuff. I don't see this as a revision to the earlier book. It's just its own animal.
And I just would have preferred to obliterate Hollywood Eve. I did my best in that book, but I got it wrong, it's not out of, like I'm an embarrassingly hard worker. I try so hard.
Right.
There were just so many holes in her memory, right? Like, I think there was no recovering this information before the boxes, you know?
Yeah. The 2 of them, though, do sit in conversation in a way that's really satisfying because
Not that you so
I no, I again, because you can't have Didion and Babitz without an understanding of Los Angeles, right? And you do put that into the new book, please don't misunderstand me, but, like, the idea that they were sort of circling each other in an orbit kinda thing, and, Didion's talked about her love of Hemingway and his influence over her, and Fitzgerald was a big thing for Babbitt's, which, I mean, like, you can't make this stuff up. I'm like, "Of course, that's how it worked out." Eve has talked about how Tender of the Night was, a touchstone for her, and I'm just kinda like, "Of course." So even the Hemingway Fitzgerald thing continue.
Right. No, that's a really shrewd observation, but it's, like, funny because if you look at who Eve's always like, the role model for Joan was always Hemingway, right?
Yeah.
And their sentences. But Eve's role model, she rips off Tender as the Night a bit, for Sex and Rage, but,
Yeah.
like, Marilyn Monroe is who she thought was the great woman artist. And that's so telling because it's like
Mhm.
was like ultra femme, totally forgotten, totally kind of hugely famous, but devalued in her own time and kind of looked at as a bimbo and just set of tits, kind of.
Right.
He's gonna have all Marilyn's problems. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do actually. It's a lot.
Cool.
But again, you're talking about levels of fame, right? Like, Monroe's level of fame, Didion's ultimately, her level of fame was stratospheric. Didion never had a real moment where people were like, "Who? What?" Like, she always maintained a
Mm.
certain level of fame. And Eve obviously disappeared for a while and her books were out of print for a long time and now have been brought back by Counterpoint and the New York Review of Books Classics, which is great.
She did not really have a moment in her time. Like, it's always so funny saying, like, rediscovered because she was not a thing, She really was sorry, I don't mean that in a bossy it just means she's one of those people that just kind of was forgotten before she was known. The
Yeah.
career was caught fire. As opposed to Didion, you're absolutely that's a very canny observation. Once Didion hits with in '68 with Slouching toward Bethlehem, she's a big deal.
Hey, but I want to talk about you for a second because you've been a journalist since go. I mean, you've also done the pod. I listened to every episode of that Bennington Writers podcast. But you've been a magazine journalist. Now you've written 2 books. I mean, you were always kind of going to do this thing, right? Like,
I tried to be a novelist. I never ever I was always wrong for me because I know from being friends with novelists, they always had a novel in their head, and I just thought Boston and I was out of it. And I felt like you could write a novel by yourself. And even though when I was growing up, the writers I read the most compulsively, Pauline, Kael, whom I mentioned, were always nonfiction writers.
Right.
Janet Malcolm is another real sweet spot for me. But I didn't really start this until 32, 33. It went much better for me because I guess it's where I was supposed to be.
But literary influences, Janet Malcolm, Pauline Kael, Joan Didion, Eve to a certain, because Eve was writing both fiction and non. So
It's all mhm, you know?
there's got to be more than just those women, right? Like, when did you start sort of thinking about this writing thing? Okay, so maybe writing fiction was not your thing, but like, when did you start thinking about writing in general, and sort of who kicked you into that space? Or was it, again, was it that Pauline Kael moment, that Joan Didion moment when you were 15?
I never could sleep as a kid. I've never
Oh,
been a good so I was always a reader because I couldn't sleep. Seems so, egomaniacal to say you wanted to be a writer, so I think I never didn't say that, until I was college and I had to, figure out a way to make my way in the world or whatever. But I used to spend a huge amount of time on my essays in school. I don't know. So but when I switched to journalism, it went so much better for me. I mean, just I feel like there's a certain things are difficult, writing is difficult, but that if something is supremely difficult, you might be in the wrong field. I feel like there's a sweet spot in terms of how hard something is for you.
but for you, is it chasing the story? Is it chasing the people? I mean, it is a different experience from sitting down to, well, essentially make everything up as you go, right? Like, you find the letter that Eve wrote to Didion. What kicked off the podcast again? What was I know you wrote the Esquire article, but, like, something kicked off the Esquire article too about the
I don't
Bennington
know
Ranch.
all of it, but I was just gonna say one of the things, and I essentially see Joan and Eve as a novel. It's just a nonfiction novel. I mean, I see us those are kind of My Brilliant Friend. Do you know? Like, I think of it in those ways. I don't to me, sometimes these distinctions are kind of meaningless, you know?
Uh-huh.
You're just kind of working with different basic material, and then you're not making it up. But at any rate, the podcast I did is a podcast. So Bennington, I originally did as a podcast. It started out as work. I knew Brett well, really quite obsessed with him and Donna Tartt. And he, it's a little bit similar to Eve in that I got in there in a personal way. And just, I feel like so much of this is access and like how much time you're spending. But I think, well, we're violating these people. That is essentially what I am doing to Eve. That is what I did to Brett. It is what I did to Joan. Well, they let you violate. Like it's like a really intimate. When I say perilous intimacy between Eve and Joan, it's also between me and my subjects. Are they going to do this to them?
So when you say access journalism too, I'm smiling a little bit because, I mean, I love a write around, and if you don't know what a write around is, basically when you don't get cooperation from a subject who is currently alive. It doesn't count if the person, but a write around, like Patrick Radden Keefe does great write around pieces. Gay Talese has sort of this legendary Esquire story. Frank Sinatra has a cold because Sinatra was like, I'm not going to talk to you, but he ends up talking to everyone in Sinatra's orbit, and we get this wild piece out of it. But I do think there's something to be said, and, then there was this period where suddenly magazines, you had to go through a million gatekeepers and scary publicists to get someone on the cover, and that's a different kind of access journalism. So I kind of wanna draw the line here that, yeah, you had the cooperation of your subjects, but, like, that's a choice that Bret Easton Ellis makes. Because also kind of notoriously, he does not really like to be interviewed. I know he's podcasting now as well. I Everyone's podcasting, but, like, notoriously is not really interested in sharing his life outside of what he chooses to share. So I always thought that was kind of fascinating that he was like, "Okay, I'll talk to you."
It's like funny because that's also like I had done one thing on him, The Canyons, his movie with Paul Schrader, and it wasn't a particularly flattering piece, but yeah, I mean, he's actually like he's really complicated because he's into his persona, meaning like in a disinterested way, almost as an art project.
Yeah.
And it was something that was appealing to him. He liked something, and then he was into somehow I got through. And he's really lets me do it, and I can do a better job if the person lets me do it. So I really no, access can be baloney, and I think with the guy, like, when you're talking about the Gay Talese, Frank Sinatra at the time Gay Talese was approaching him, had been famous for so long, there's no getting into him. There's no getting in. There's so much thickness in that persona, you cannot penetrate it. You can It's not even right? So even if he got access, he wasn't gonna have access, and I always felt that was true of Joan too. But that wasn't true of Eve, and that isn't true of Brett. So it's like you have to figure out your way inside.
Well, and then we get a cool thing to read or listen to. That's kind of how I look at it. I'm like, listen, if you wanna chase the story, I will pick it up on the other end. I think writers are sort of endlessly fascinating, especially when you sort of compare where they're coming from in the work itself, right?
And someone like Joan who was so shrewd about her
Mhm.
being a persona and what was the real origin story. I mean, and she's her own subject and she writes kind of confessional work, except she only tells you what she wants you to know. I also just think like nobody had a better career than Joan Didion. No American writer, possible exception of Hemingway, was assured a career of. And seeing how she did it, fascinating and instructive. As fascinating and instructive as it is to like apart her book, because she was her own project. At some level, she was her own art project.
I love the description of her as an art project because, I mean, Eve also always kind of saw herself as an art project as and a literal art project when she poses for that photo, which for years I'd known the photo, and it's this sort of very famous naked girl sitting with a guy playing chess, and it's an older man, it turns out to be Marcel Duchamp. I had no idea it was her. I just always because you would see it reproduced on, like, T-shirts and posters and college dorm rooms and all of this kind of stuff, and you're like, "What is going on here?" But Eve sort of approached her life as an art project, all of it.
All of it, and I think also when you know the story behind that photograph, Julian Wasser was one of the first people I interviewed. He took the photo of Eve naked playing chess with Duchamp, but he took all those famous Joan photos,
Right.
smoking and Stingray, iconographic photos of both women one man took. And I remember he was a gentleman with Eve in a sense where he talked to her about which photo he was gonna use, and she wanted him to use the one where she had no face, where
Right.
faced by her hair, the veil. So it's like she's an exhibitionist, but also quite intensely private, and that was true at the time too. So just kind of penetrating that was great fun.
Do you have a favorite Babitz?
Yes.
Which one?
Not even close. Slow Days, Not Company.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm doing a book similar to do a book now on him. I think that's going to be really good because her letters are so great.
Oh, I cannot wait. Do we have a pub date for or, like, a rough release date? You'll get to it when okay.
2025, like 2025. I've done a ton of work on it, but it's just that, these things, they just take as long as they take.
I no, I totally get it. I am gonna flash the jacket, though, on, Slow Days, Fast Company because it's so good, and it might be my I don't know. I go back and forth. I mean, Didion, it's always play it as it lays for me, but and then, the essays certainly, I mean, don't I'm not a total barbarian, but play it as it lays, I think just hit me at exactly when you get a book and it just hits you in that moment and you're like,
No, it's
this is the
powerful.
one. This is the one."
Between Eve, what would it be if it wasn't for those for you?
I am honestly, I'm looking at a stack of I think I might be biased towards Eve's Hollywood.
Great. It's tight.
Yeah, I think honestly, all respect to Counterpoint, I love their books too, but
They did so good.
yeah, no, the packaging is great, but I'm also just happy to see them out in the world. Yeah, I really do think it comes between Slow Days and Eve's Hollywood, even though I don't know, I just her voice is really sticky for me.
Yeah.
It's really, really sticky. I mean, the way Didion's voice is really sticky. There's certain writers where, especially if you hit them when you're young, I
Yes.
think, I may have imprinted on Didion like a baby duck. I'm not like, sometimes you catch turns of phrase or something and you're like, "Oh, oh, right.
Gideon.
I know who my influences are." And honestly, I'm just writing copy. I'm not like, this is not even not just I'm writing shelf talkers for stores. I'm writing copy for the show. I'm just like, "Oh, right. Hi." There's
Practice the world, that's how she started, those are hard to do, those short little things, like what you're doing.
well, writing copy, you should still care about sentences and you should still care about words. And it does pop for me when people are like, I have to write a thing. And, blah, blah, blah," and I'm like, well, just do it well. It can be short, but it can be good.
Short and great.
I'm really excited about the letters project, though. That is very cool because I mean, I like dipping out. I have a collection of Ralph Ellison letters that I like to dip in and out of. And it will probably take me 400 years to finish the whole thing. But like, you can just open it randomly and be like, oh, hi.
Pretty good.
And just keep it I love keeping stuff by the nightstand. Hey, what's on your reading list lately?
Christopher Bowen. I read The Destroyers and I loved it.
Oh, Chris. Oh, yes. No, he is great.
Yeah, no, he's totally fantastic. And I just reread Howard's End. I'm reading a biography of, I'm working on something on Paula Fox and Courtney Love. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've been reading.
Wow.
I'm rereading everything by Paula Fox. I just finished Waltzing Close, which was totally great. And I'm reading a Kurt Cobain biography. So I have a couple of books going. And then the last thing I'm reading, do you know Nancy Lemon? She's a Southern writer who's kind of coming back. I'm only 20 pages in. With Jeff Dyer recommendation. Let's just see.
Oh, that guy has good taste.
He has great taste. That's why I want to get this right. Yeah, and she's coming back. She's
Okay.
The Lives of the Saints. It's a Southern novel. It's not like the title is not. It's not a religious book. Just
No, I know it's not. No, I know it's not. And I'm just like, oh, wait a minute. I think I do know this book. And now I'm going to go down a rabbit hole because that's what I like to do. I'm always curious to know what people are reading because, I mean, we all just pull from wildly different places. And I'm always curious to see what people are up to. So wait, okay, you've got the Letters book next. You've got Courtney Love and Paula Fox. I mean, it sounds like you have your groove, though. Working around writers and writing and the craft and everything else, and that, like, this is it. This is the thing.
This is what I love, and, like, Paula Fox and Courtney Love are very exciting, and I'm born in '78, so, I was really paying attention when Courtney came along. And Paula Fox, like, the timing of Paula Fox was another one. Like, there was a precedent for Eve Babitz kind of coming on in this big way. Paula Fox is the only other real example I can think of where she got good reviews when she was writing, but she was not, like, a household name by any small. But when I came out of college, it was like Franzen and Lethem were championing her, and Downing, if I'm saying her name right, wrote a great profile of her in the Times. And all of a sudden, all her books were reissued, and I read everything by her. But yeah, so she's great, And it was Brooklyn was having a moment, and she was a Brooklyn novelist.
Yep.
It's like you can see how the timing of things can just sometimes go in your favor,
No, I remember all of this because I read Desperate Characters and Coldest Winter
Oh yeah,
back to back because I think Coldest Winter was coming out as a new hardcover, and everyone was like, and I think that's when she was profiled in the Times. It was this moment of like, wait, what's going on? And Desperate Characters had just been reissued, and then there were a couple of other novels, and I was like, okay, I'll give it a whirl.
the Borrowed Finery. She has two memoirs.
Oh yeah,
Borrowed Finery comes out in 2001, right after Desperate Characters got reissued in '99.
right. Okay, yeah, and then Coldest Winter is after that, right?
Comes out like maybe 10 years later.
Oh wow.
I know. The sequence is funny. I bet you're thinking because they're both memoirs. I bet it's
No, I'm sure. No, I'm sure I just conflated them completely. I mean, it happens. We do what we can. I mean, I'm just excited when people talk about Paula Fox because it really, there was that moment and she was sort of white hot and then it sort of petered out again. And I'm like, wait. I mean, Dawn Powell, same thing. Like, this happens quite frequently with women writers. Like, I'm delighted that Gail Jones is publishing again. I'm like, where has she been hiding out? Like, and do whatever you're going to do. It's, but every couple of years I get a new Gail Jones and I'm like, hi, this is great.
where are you? Great to have you.
And she's living her life and writing her stuff and all of that. All right, Lily, we're going to start giving up secrets from the book that I'm not ready to give up because I really do want readers to be able to experience the book the way I did, which is I mean, all I knew, honestly, the first time I read it was in bound manuscript, so like I didn't have the jacket. I knew your name and I knew the earlier book and I was like, okay, great, just send it to me. And I started reading and I was like, this is fabulous. So before we give up all of the good stuff, because again, like it's such a fun read. And it's also kind of a puzzle just watching you piece together how everyone connects, right? It's good. It's great. It's so good.
Because I'll blab, I'll just say whatever. So
Right. So no, we want people to be able to read the book. So this is where I say, Lili Anolik, thank you so much. This was so much fun. And we'll wait for the letters. Eve Babitz. Can't wait.
25 sometime. But this was a pleasure and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.